The following video is part of the recent split-top Rubo Guild build. For more information about this project or to join the guild, go to woodwhispererguild.com.
The power tool method for flattening a workbench is really pretty cool. It's a lot like a CNC machine. Your router is going to go into a sled, and that sled is going to ride along two rails. These rails will be attached to the outside of the bench. And the idea is your bit is set at a fixed depth. So anything that's higher than that depth gets chewed away by the router bit. And when it's all said and done, you have a nice flat workbench. Now the reason why I like this so much is because this isn't just a single-use jig. You can use this apparatus to flatten all kinds of unwieldy large boards. So if you have a real big slab that just is not going to fit through your planer, and you don't feel like taking the time to try to flatten it by hand, you can use this system to flatten it perfectly using the router. So this is something you can just kind of put the jig in the corner of the shop, and there will be a time, I guarantee you, where you're going to want to use this again. So there's a few parts that we need to make, but it's all made with cheap materials and construction-grade lumber. So let's jump right into it. The router sled is going to be comprised of 3 pieces of 3/4-inch plywood. You've got a base piece and then 2 fence pieces on either side. Right? These fence pieces serve to guide the router back and forth, but they also stiffen up this structure. Without these, you're going to get a sag, right? And these prevent that from happening. So the dimensions of the fences are 4 inches wide by 32 inches long. The 32 inches accounts for the fact that we need to bring the router all the way out to the edge. If we terminate exactly at 24, we're never going to get there. We're going to have part of the router unsupported. So we want to make sure we add a few inches per side. I added 4 per side for a total of 32. Now the base piece is a bit of a different story. We're going to go to 32 inches. It should match the length of your fence pieces, but the width is going to be variable. It's going to depend on the width of your base. I really want the fences to sort of guide the base as it goes through. So what you need to do is measure the diameter. Now obviously this festool base is kind of wacky looking. I just took this dimension from the longest flat to the other end. If you have a circular base, it's a little bit easier. But here's the formula. You take the width of the base and add 1.5 inches, and that accounts for your 2 fences. Now the reason we add 1.5 inches, because I'm sure some of you are saying, but Mark, plywood is not exactly 3/4 of an inch. That's actually going to work in our favor. Because these pieces are slightly undersized, that gives us just a little bit of breathing room for that router. If it was perfectly tight, you would probably have trouble sliding the router back and forth. All right, so that little bit, which is basically about a 32nd of an inch under for each of these pieces, is perfect for the router. So take the width of your base, add 1.5 inches, and that should be the width of your base piece. Before we attach our fence pieces to our base, it's a good idea to remove a channel of material for that router bit, because we're going to plunge down and move across the bench. So it's a good idea if that material is already gone, so we don't have to plow through it with the router bit. Now where this channel goes is really dependent on the shape of your base. You may notice that mine is slightly offset. This is just a product of the way my base is shaped. The router bit just happens to land right there. If you have a perfectly round base, you're going to be pretty much dead center. Right, so that's one thing that you need to know. The other thing is the width of this channel really just depends on the bit that you're going to use. If you decide to use something like our 1/2 inch router bit that we've been using in this project, all you really need is a channel that's just a little bit wider than a 1/2 inch. Now, you can use this, but think about it. The size of this bench, it's going to take forever to go over this with a 1/2 inch bit. So if you have the means, I do recommend going with something wider. This is a Amana bit that's 1.75 inches in diameter. All right, this monster is going to chew away some material pretty quickly, and it's going to allow me to get through the entire bench in much less time. There's also a comparable one made by Freud, which you can check out, that's a little bit cheaper. Okay, so I need to make sure that my bit is going to safely fit into this channel. So my channel here is a little bit wider than the bit itself. All right, so to cut this, I'm just going to drill a couple holes and use my jigsaw. Now I'm just going to put 1 hole at each corner, and before I go any further, I should mention that this line here stops about 4 inches from the edge. I don't really need this slot to be any wider than the workpiece that the bit is going to have to cover. And so I'm going to try and locate this so I don't go over my lines, but this does not have to be absolutely perfect. Using my jigsaw and a very fine-tooth blade, I'm just going to drop the blade into the hole and essentially connect the dots and try to follow my line as best as I can. Even using a really fine blade, you're still going to get some tear out in plywood, so just go ahead and sand that away. Now I've got my two fence pieces in place, and I've got my base upside down, and we could do the assembly this way. We can kind of just position everything where it needs to be, and then pre-drill and drive some screws into the fence material. So what I want to do is make sure that I clamp these down, because sometimes when you drive those screws, they have a tendency to push the material one way or the other. So if there's a clamp there, it's going to be much less likely that that's going to happen. So we'll use a little bit of glue. I guess you don't really have to use glue, but I kind of like to. Just a nice thin bead. Drop the base on top. And all I really need to do is make sure that it's nice and flush on the ends and flush along the length. The other thing I want to point out is if your fence pieces are cut nice and straight, those are what establish the flatness of the base. If this had a big curve in it, the base would then conform to that. So as long as you cut your pieces straight, you shouldn't have any problems with this base being nice and flat along its length. All right, that feels pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add a clamp here. Now I'm just going to pre-drill and countersink for screws. Inch and a quarter screw should do the trick. Now if I just flip the piece around, we can attach the other fence in the same exact way. And just like that, a router sled is born. Probably not a bad idea to make sure your router fits. There we go. That's exactly what we're looking for. As I mentioned before, the router sled is going to ride on two rails, and those rails will be attached to the front and the back of the bench. So those rails really can be made out of just about anything that you can get a nice straight edge on. So for me, I don't really have anything that's this long, a full 8 feet long, that would work for this. So I just went out and got two 2x6s, construction grade 2x6s. These are kiln dried. I would recommend you go with a kiln dried stock if you can get it, because they'll be more stable after you mill them. Even with that, these tend to hold a lot more moisture than we're used to. So when you mill them, do this process on the very same day. If you mill these ahead of time and leave it for a couple days and come back, I guarantee you these edges will no longer be nice and straight. So mine are freshly milled. I basically just skip planed them. I had to make sure when I was at the store to get the straightest ones possible so that I could very easily skip plane and just put one jointed edge. You don't necessarily need the other edge to be jointed because we're only referencing from one side. All right, so once you have them at this stage, the edge is nice and straight, we can attach them to the bench with a couple of clamps. Now, if you've got a helper, attaching these rails should be fairly easy. If you're by yourself, it's a lot more difficult. So what I'm going to do is attach a couple of clamps to the bench, one on each side, and I keep them fairly low. Then I can bring my rail in, like so, put it on top of that clamp, and that should hold it in place temporarily. I'll put one on the other side. Now with the two rails in position, I could just take another clamp and clamp the rails to the bench. Add one on this side too. And now we can remove that first set of clamps. We don't need them anymore. They were just acting as another set of hands, basically. With the rails held in place, we can now make some adjustments to get these rails in the right position. Now, first of all, they're really high right now. I want them down lower because if you think about it, when the sled is moving back and forth, we've got to plunge that bit down far enough to make contact with the bench. So the higher these rails are, the further that bit has to travel. I'd rather not have to extend it too far. So realistically, the rails don't need to be very much higher than the benchtop surface itself. So I'm going to aim for, I don't know, maybe a ½ inch. Sounds good to me. So I'm going to take my dead blow, I'm going to start making slight adjustments. If the rails aren't moving, obviously you might want to loosen the clamp a little bit, but not too much because you don't want it to fall. I've got my adjustable square set to a ½ inch, and I could just sight from the side here and make little adjustments to try to get this rail just about a ½ inch above the bench. I'll do the same thing at this corner. And the same thing on the front left. So I have a ½ inch on this side, a ½ inch on this side, and a ½ inch over there. That corner is the one that's unknown. So really my goal at this point is to get the two rails to be parallel with one another. And I'd really rather not touch this one because it's even on this side, even on this side, and I'm pretty confident that my front slab is fairly flat to begin with. So I can clamp this front one in place and not really count on moving it at all. So how do we make sure that that back rail is perfectly parallel with this front rail? Well, here's the old trick. Basically, you're going to take string or some sort of a cord. In this case, I have some plastic coated metal wire. This is just sold by the foot at Home Depot. It's got good visibility, it's thick, and it's going to help us see what we're trying to do here. All right, so I've already got one strung across from corner to corner. So let's install the second one from that corner to this corner. Since this is just temporary, I'm just going to use a screw with a little washer here and drive it into the rail. Once I'm pretty close, I will take the string or your cord or whatever you purchased for this, wrap it around the screw. It's a little hard to bend. And drill in. Okay, nice grip there. Another screw at the diagonal corner. I could take my cord here and wrap it around the screw. Now this one you want to pull tight because you want this to be a fairly taut connection. So I'm going to wrap it around, give it a good tug. And tighten it up. Now let's take a look at where the two cords intersect and put your thinking cap on because sometimes this can be a little bit confusing to envision. But essentially, if our two rails are perfectly parallel with one another, these two strings where they meet in the middle will want to go right through each other. Now, of course, they can't do that because they're made of actual solid material. So what we need to do is take this top string, and we could take some cutoff material. We need to raise this top cord basically the thickness of one piece of string. So then, when we come back and look here, when these two pieces just kiss one another, when they first make contact, we know that they're exactly parallel, but it's only because we raised this top string by the thickness of one piece of cord. All right, so let's install those. Just gonna slide it over here. And we put the other one at the opposite corner. So just to recap, the string that's on top now has a little cutoff underneath it to raise it up on this corner and this corner. The other two are left exactly as they were. So now when these two strings touch one another, we can be pretty sure that these rails are nice and parallel. So let's take a close look at what we've got right now. We basically have a gap between the two strings here. It's about 1/4 inch. All right, so the way we're going to resolve this is to tap one of the corners down until these two strings touch one another. Now before locking everything in, I want to go back and make sure that the three corners that I had set at 1/2 inch are still there. And it's a very good possibility that things have moved because we were hammering on one of the rails. So you just want to make sure that they're all in alignment, make any adjustments, and keep going back and looking in the middle to make sure that those two strings are just kissing one another. So just as a bit of a reality check, I'm going to measure this back corner. This is the one that we know slopes up. We don't know how much it slopes up, but I double checked and we're at 1/2 inch everywhere else. So if this slopes up and this rail is parallel to the rail in the front, then we know that this distance should be less than 1/2 inch. And in fact, when I measure it, I've got about 1/4 inch, which tells me that this is a little bit more of a slope up than I really thought it was, if we have to remove 1/4 inch extra material here. All right, so one more thing we can check in the dead center. I'll show you a neat little trick for making sure that those two cords really are just touching one another. When you push down with just a little bit of pressure on the lower cord, you should not see that top cord move at all. If it does move, it means that they are actually making a little bit too much contact. You would want to lift the top chord up a little bit to remedy that. Right? So when I push down, that top chord does not move at all. But when I push down on the top chord, I can't even touch the top chord without the bottom chord moving. Do you see that? So no movement of the top chord when I'm pushing down on the bottom, and immediate movement when I push down on the top. And that tells me that these surfaces are just touching one another. So at this point, I'm going to tighten up my clamps, and I'm even going to add another one in the middle just for some extra support. And of course, we don't need the screws or the cords anymore. So the goal now is to put our sled on top of the rails, drop our router in place, and then we're just going to make one pass and move the router forward. Make another pass, move the router forward. So that's a lot of movement on this carriage here. So it's probably a good idea to use a little bit of wax. And that should make it a little bit easier to slide this router back and forth. Now your goal is to plunge the router down to what would essentially be the lowest spot of the workbench. Now I don't know absolutely for sure, but based on my measurements, my observations with the surface, I'm guessing that right about here at the end cap is going to be the lowest spot. Now it could very well be consistent all the way across. We won't really know until we start cutting into it, but this should be pretty close. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to plunge this big old bit down until it makes contact with the wood. And then I'm going to tighten it up. I'm going to hold that setting for the entire process. Well, everything's in position. I'm just going to take my first pass and see how we do. So after just a couple of passes, we could take a look at our progress. Now I did go back and I used a pencil to mark up the surface, and this gives us a good visual reference here. And you can see the dividing line from where I've removed material and where I haven't. This really is only about a 32nd of an inch, and that's not too bad, especially for this initial flattening process. The other thing I want to note here is that we are cutting into our rails, and that's perfectly fine. These are sacrificial. They're meant to be cut into, and you want to get the bit as close as you can to the edge. Now, I'm not too worried about it. If I've got a little bit of material to remove later, I could certainly do that with a scraper or a plane. That's not a problem at all. But as you can see, with a bit like that, leaves you pretty much with a nice smooth surface that really isn't going to need a whole lot of work when it's all said and done. So I'm just going to put the router back in place and work my way across the bench. Now before I make my last pass, I just wanted to show you what we're dealing with here, and that what we see actually confirms my suspicions early on that my back slab had a bit of a twist in it. It's interesting because, you think about how you get to this point and how something like this might happen, and sometimes you can't even really identify what you did wrong to cause this. But the bottom line is, with the bench top secured, we can now flatten this out, remove this extra stock, and be pretty confident that the bench top is going to be nice and stable and stay flat. But as you can see, I do have a substantial amount of material that's being removed at the back, and at the front here, I'm still removing about a 32nd of an inch, maybe a 16th of an inch at the most right here. But it does get pretty deep in the back, and this is one of those cases where I'm glad I did this with a router, because this would have been a heck of a lot of work to remove all that stock with a hand plane. So, each method certainly has its merits, but in some cases, you might find the power tool method to be certainly less labor intensive. So after a couple minutes of vacuuming, I could actually see the top of my workbench again, which is great. It turned out really nice. Of course, the router bit leaves a little bit of a sort of scalloped pattern to the top. Now, the truth is, you can keep that in there. You don't have to flatten that out, because a lot of times your bench, if it has a little bit of texture to it, is going to grip your work pieces better. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend going at this with a smoothing plane just to make it glass smooth, because the more slippery your workbench top is, the harder it's going to be to work on. All right, so I'm probably just going to hit this with a sander or maybe a cabinet scraper just to do some further smoothing. I should also point out that I have little triangles here that were left because I'm using a circular bit. It only goes so far, and then it winds up just leaving this little triangle. Very easy to get rid of that with a block plane. Now, even though the rails for this flattening process were sacrificial, the sled is not. This is something that you can hang on to and reuse again in the future. In fact, in the future, it's probably going to be even easier because if you have a slab of material, you could just lay that down on the workbench, take some shims, make sure it's nice and stable and sitting flat, and then all you need to do is grab 2 new rail pieces and rest them on the bench. As long as both sides of that rail piece are parallel with one another, basically you joint one edge and then rip the other at the table saw, place those down, clamp them to the workbench, you now have a perfect reference surface because the bench is flat. The reason we had to do the string thing before is because we really didn't have a perfectly flat reference. We just clamped to the outside and needed to make sure that those 2 rails were in the same plane. So in the future, it's much easier. And if you have the ability to get a hold of some sort of metal rails or something, you might even want to check out metal studs and see if those are nice and true. You can have a permanent solution for flattening large projects. Think about an end grain cutting board. There's something a lot of people have trouble flattening. Wouldn't it be great to just slap it down and within a couple minutes with the router, you have a nice flat board to work with? Well, that's something you can do if you've got this carriage set up. Now, here's the thing. This is very basic. This is as bare bones of a setup as you could possibly get, but you can get pretty elaborate with it. In fact, Fine Woodworking, a couple issues ago, in fact, it's December 2011, had a great article with the dude from Community, who apparently does a lot of large natural edge slab tables and things like that. So he's got a very elaborate setup, and his sled is much more sophisticated than ours, but it's a really nice shop-made solution for flattening large surfaces. So if you want to really, spice it up a little bit, check out that article and, email me with your ideas because I'd love to see them.